Now we are joined by Abdullah al Andalusi, who is a political commentator. Thank you for joining us, Abdullah. He's an instructor and he's an international speaker, thinker, and intellectual activist for Islam and Muslim affairs. He's an instructor and head of the Department of Occidentology at the Quran Institute and co-founder and discussion forum of the Muslim Debate Initiative. Abdullah, welcome.
Thank you.
We are hearing, it seems, growing voices for calling for a ceasefire. And there seems to be an indication both from Hamas that they would be prepared to discuss a ceasefire, not an exchange of prisoners, not like the last time, but a cessation of violence. And Israel's Prime Minister Isaac Herzog saying something similar. Are you hopeful we are moving towards an endgame here?
Well, basically, there's been growing international pressure on Israel to limit its bombing campaign, as well as to have a ceasefire and bring an end to the violence, because there's no kind of end in sight. Hamas are a well-entrenched organization within Gaza, and so I think people are realizing that if this was allowed to continue, the civilian death toll would just climb higher and higher and higher, and this has led to many people being very worried and concerned over their links with Israel. Many of these Western governments, from the United States to even the Tory-led British government, and they want to bring this, they want to rein this in before their own populations put a lot of pressure on them. And of course, coming up to the elections with Donald Trump and Biden, so this is basically the issue that's come about. So yes, there is a lot of pressure, and Israel is facing a lot of pressure. Although there's a strong pressure within Israel, a bloodlust, you could call it, to want to basically continue the bombardment of Gaza and wiping out the Gazans. Many have called, including news pundits, have called for the complete wiping out of Gaza. And this is something which I think is what the Israeli government are trying to balance out, which is how do they respond to international pressure while continuing what many deem to be a genocidal campaign to push out the Gazans out of Gaza, and for the Likud party, who are the ruling party of the state of Israel, to achieve its objective of a greater Israel, where they would completely annex both Gaza and the West Bank without having to deal with the Palestinians that reside there.
Now, you recently appeared on the Piers Morgan show. We've got this clip. Let's watch it and we can talk about that.
So considering that you have justified the operation that Israel initiated as self-defense, and that you refuse to call Israel a terrorist organization or a terrorist government, despite the fact that almost as many Palestinians, Gazans, have died under Israel's precision bombing, then as Londoners have died during the whole year of the Blitz under German bombing, which wasn't precision bombing, and yet you still say that, well, Israel isn't a terrorist organization. I think the question we should be asking is, should you be suspended? Is it responsible to have a person with your views speaking to the public when you clearly refuse to condemn that which needs to be condemned, which was worse than the London Blitz? Those that
perfectly reasonable,
with precision weapons, and the Germans didn't even have precision weapons.
Perfectly reasonable question.
Yes.
And you've asked me it on my show.
Yes.
The fact you're here and able to ask that, I think, is evidence that I'm prepared to listen to people who will look me in the eye and ask me difficult questions.
Well, you didn't know I was going to say that, but anyway, yes.
That's fine, but that's fine. You're perfectly entitled to it.
Yeah.
We believe in uncensored free speech here.
Yeah.
But let me ask you the question then, which I asked.
You're not answering my question, but you haven't answered it.
Well, I have. I said I don't think they're a terrorist organisation.
Despite the fact that they've killed almost as many as
You've
Germans did
asked me a question.
when they bombed London under the Blitz for 1 year with non-precision bombs.
I have given you an unequivocal answer. Now let me ask you if you can give me one.
Yes.
Do you believe Hamas are a terror organisation?
Okay, and I'd like to ask you, what does that mean?
Just answer my question.
Well, I need clarification.
Well, this country has prescribed them as a terror group. Do you think they are?
Are you the British government?
No, I'm asking you what you think.
Okay, so I want a clarification.
I gave you a simple, straight answer.
What does it mean?
No, you tell me.
I don't know. You're asking me a question. You asked the question.
You don't think they are a terror group?
No, I want your definition of what is a terror group?
An act that commits acts of terror, a group that commits terror attacks, as they did on October the 7th.
So one that commits terror attack. All right, fine. So define terror.
Do you want to answer the question
attack.
or not?
I do, but I just want clarification.
No. We all know what terrorism is.
Please, no. Don't worry. We're going to go somewhere with this. We're going to go somewhere with this, right?
Well, are you going to answer the question?
Yes. Once I get your definition, what's a terror attack?
The definition is as is laid down in international law.
Which
it's
is
committing an act of terror.
Which is
terrorism.
Are you asking questions you don't know the definition of?
Well, why don't you tell me what you think it is?
I don't know. You're asking the question.
You've no idea what terrorism is.
No, I want you to answer your question.
I would say massacring 1,200 people on October the 7th in the way Hamas did is an act of terror. Do you agree?
So killing civilians is an act of terror?
No, that's not what I said.
So then killing civilians
Committing
is not an act of terror.
on that scale is terrorism.
So killing civilians is not an act of terror.
You're not going to answer. Let me bring
I want your definition.
No.
I want you to be consistent.
We have a third guest.
No, but I want to say something.
All right.
United States recognized PLO as a terrorist and it negotiates with PLO. This is one thing. The second, October 7 happened and many things happened after. Are we here just stuck there as a snapshot and to discuss it, or we want to discuss what after and what can be done in a better way? That's the most important.
I think they're all important issues, but right now, because of what happened in the fallout from last night's show, I specifically want to discuss the definition of terrorism, Hamas, and whether a British doctor...
But Hamas is not the Palestinian people.
Hang on.
But we haven't had that definition yet.
I'm going to bring in our third... definition.
Abdullah, I can recall conservatives in this country calling Nelson Mandela a terrorist. I can remember, obviously, calling Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, and other architects of the Northern Ireland peace process terrorist. The global south is littered with people who were formerly called terrorists, who then went on to become heads of state and were lauded. We're entering quite a loaded territory when you discuss this, and it's a motive as well. I mean, this is not just a neutral concept. There isn't ground and fast rules for saying what terrorism is or isn't.
Well, basically, there are definitions that have been given by different people. One of the problems with this is that some are quite broad. So the definition in the UK is basically any violence done for political ends, in essence, which covers every single war in human history by every state, because all states, the definition of war is violence for political ends. And so the British government has kept it nice and broad so they can capture anyone they want to capture. I mean, technically speaking, if you call to fight Russia in Ukraine, that would be terrorism by the definition of law of England and Wales. Of course, the Crown Prosecution Service don't prosecute people for calling to or advocating for terrorism just because you're calling to fight Russia in Ukraine. You're calling to Ukrainians to fight Russia, even though it would, in theory, be covered under that law. But also the international understanding of it is they define it as a sub-state actor. So a state, less than a state, any actor that's less than a state, any group, organization that's not a state, that engages in violence, specifically targeting civilians. And they've defined that way to prevent states from falling under that definition. So some international definitions allow states to commit acts of terrorism, but it's not called terrorism purely because it's done by a state, literally because it's done by a state, not done by, quote unquote, less than a state. And of course, this brings up the question as to how you would define Hamas, because Hamas classify itself as a government, as an administration over an area of land. They are recognized by a number of governments as being a government. And so how would that fall into the category? And so really, there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of debate and discussion. And what I tried to highlight when I required Piers Morgan to define the question he was going to ask me, and he asked, like, well, don't you know what terrorism is? And I said, but I don't know his definition. Like, you give me your definition so I can answer what you mean by it, because then we can have a discussion. He was unable to define it. And of course, the closer he gets to a definition, the more he gets closer to something that would condemn, for example, the British government. And I always bring the example of World War II and Winston Churchill's ordering of terror bombing, deliberate bombing of German civilians for the sake of inducing pressure on the German government, because that is something that he praises, or he feels to be something that was justified. So he doesn't want to actually condemn that, and then his hypocrisy is exposed when he was unable to, or didn't want to, or he argued that, well, because Britain was trying to defend itself against an existential threat to its liberty, its political freedom, that it was justified to fight the enemy like this. And then I again pointed to his inconsistency. I said, well, the Palestinians could argue that same thing. Their self-determination under international law, which is considered to be a sovereign principle in international law, their sovereign right to self-determination is completely at threat. In fact, it's being denied by Israel. So using Piers Morgan's justifications, would that justify that too? Of course, he doesn't want to settle any consistency. And I asked for him consistency, and he was unable to produce a consistent answer. But that never stopped him from demanding other people to condemn Hamas. And of course, throughout that interview with Piers Morgan, well, it wasn't an interview, it was more of a debate. It was a debate with a panel. Unfortunately, it wasn't a one-to-one. I could have pressed him more. But in that discussion, I wanted to press him on the issue of the fact that, look, more Gazan civilians have died in 2 months of precision bombing with smart weapons, with mostly smart weapons, by the Israeli state than all the Londoners that died during World War II from the Blitz, from Germans bombing with V1 rockets, V2 rockets, and just bombing from their planes, using dumb bombs, unguided bombs. So almost as many Gazans, have died as World War II for that. The whole World War II bombing by Germans of London. Doesn't that indicate that Israel is just going for destruction? It's just going to deliberately target civilians. And so if that's the case, should it not be condemned as a terrorist organization? That was what I was highlighting throughout the whole discussion.
You wouldn't defend Hamas's actions on the 7th of October. Take into account that the proportion dead on the 7th of October is no longer comparable to the number of dead in Gaza. But even so, you wouldn't defend the 7th of October operations.
As I said in that debate with Piers Morgan, that there is no justification for the deliberate targeting of civilians. Whoever is doing the targeting and whoever is being targeted, there is no justification. All deliberate targeting of non-combatants is to be condemned by everyone. And that's what I wanted from him.
And that is the point. The targeting of hospitals, the targeting of schools, mass reprisals on a civilian population, all of this was made illegal after the Second World War under international law. There is very clear international law.
Yes, that's what the Geneva Conventions were brought in to prevent the deliberate targeting of civilians in order to induce pressure against the government. And there was a recent journalism piece by Israeli journalists who uncovered with their intelligence service, with their intelligence contacts within the Israeli military, there was actually a deliberate policy of bombing civilians, which are called by the Israeli military as power targets. That they were targets that were civilian targets designed to induce pressure on the Hamas government. So we are getting undercover, we're getting investigative journalism uncovering, Israeli investigative journalism is uncovering that Israel's deliberate policy of targeting civilians. And what I really wanted from Piers Morgan was for him to condemn Israel for engaging in acts of terror against the population of Gaza for potentially genocidal purposes.
I mean, this goes back to the very origins of Israel, because in Deir Yassin, the massacre of civilians by the Haganah, which was well publicized. Haganah publicized this at the time. They sent speaker vans out telling people in Arab villages this is what had happened. They allowed a small number of survivors to leave deliberately so they could spread that news. So this is going back, as I say, to the very origins of the Israeli state.
Oh, I mean, indeed, the Israeli state from 1947, when it initiated a clearing or ethnic cleansing operation against the Palestinians, but before anyone attacked them, there was no invading armies from Arab states coming in. They initiated the ethnic cleansing, and it was because of all the Palestinians streaming out, seeking refuge against the ethnic cleansing, that the surrounding kind of governments were under pressure from their people to come rescue the Palestinians. That's actually what initiated the war, was to rescue the Palestinians from the ethnic cleansing that was happening. But to mention a point that you before, which is people in history who've been part of terrorist organizations and have engaged in terrorism become, prime ministers and leaders and so on. Menachem Begin, for example, was one such individual. Was part of a terrorist organization during the British rule of the Mandate of Palestine, and then, of course, became the prime minister of State of Israel. In fact, many of the ruling party, Likud, actually came from the Jabotinsky kind of militant movement within the Zionist settlers in Israel before it became independent, which were engaged in active fighting and bombing and so on and so forth, which was motivating many actual terrorist organizations called the Stern Gan Irgun and many others. So the Likud itself, its ancestry was in a terrorist kind of thinking, terrorist kind of movement back in the day, and this has all become now normalized when now they've gotten the political power and they're all politicians, and so we should be under no illusion that they are very much continuing the type of thinking, the type of terrorism that they engaged in over 70 years ago. Today, it's always continued. The policy of Israel has always been quite consistent when it comes to collective punishment of Palestinians, as well as disproportionate response to if there's a criminal action by any small minority of Palestinians, all Palestinians are made to suffer.
I mean, going back to the wider thing as well, I mean, we're also talking about internationally providing weapons to Israel, which is used in this way. It could mean that Britain, the United States, could be in the dock as well internationally.
Well, if war crimes are demonstrated, and of course, if the International Court of Justice, and many, there's been some sources saying that those close to the International Court of Justice are worried to investigate Israel for war crimes, because if they do investigate Israel for war crimes and war crimes are proven, then all of those who supplied weapons knowing that these war crimes were going on will also be complicit, which includes the United States government and the UK government and quite a few other governments. So this is going to be a very big case, a class action, you could say, in the criminal in criminal proceedings for war crimes. And so this is what should happen in a fair world where people are investigated for war crimes, no matter who they are and who supported them. But unfortunately, I don't think we'll see that.
Abdullah al Andalusi, thank you very much for joining us and for your insights on that. We're going to take a short break now. Please join us after that break for our continuing news coverage of the war in Palestine and the growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Islam Channel's growing news coverage of the war in Palestine and the growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Myself, Chris Banbury. We're now joined once more by Abdullah al Andalusi, who's an international speaker, thinker, and intellectual activist for Islam and Muslim affairs. Welcome back, Abdullah. When we're looking at the situation here in Palestine, it's clear that the Israelis cannot succeed in destroying Hamas for the reasons you alluded to, that they have popular support in the enclave. That can't be denied. And that now, almost 3 months into this campaign, Hamas are still out and others are still able to fire rockets into Israel. They're still fighting in Gaza City, which was supposedly taken at the beginning of this campaign. This isn't quite going to plan, is it?
No, there are reports of mounting casualties in the Israeli army from Gaza City and other places where Hamas is using hit-and-run attacks against the army and continuing to strike it. And this was something which I suppose it seems by many analysts that Hamas was kind of relying on, and even inviting Israel before the ground invasion began to come in to Gaza to engage it on the ground. So clearly Hamas appear to have prepared for a extended ground operation, and they are continuing to fight, despite the fact that they are fighting in areas which the Israeli government has declared to be cleared areas. So this is what's continuing to happen. But it seems to many analysts that Israel's strategy had been to pressure the Gazan civilians, and Human Rights Watch was just recently mentioned the use of starvation as a weapon of war, so that Gazans will begin to flee Gaza itself. But seeing as the Rafah boarding is closed because Egypt understands, and many of the Arab governments surrounding understands, that if the Palestinians are allowed to leave, they'll never be allowed to return back. Much the same thing happened in 1948 once they left their homes to escape the bombardment, the mortars, the terror campaigns by the Haganah and then the Israeli army. They were never allowed to return back to their properties. And so many of the people in Gaza are refugees from areas which are now considered to be part of Israel proper. So Israel was kind of inculcating conditions designed to, in essence, destroy a part of the Gazan population through bombardment, through no access to water, no access to electricity, no access to food, and this has been remarked upon. The issue is now they're not being released. So now they've been kind of from Gaza, not being kind of removed from Gaza, much that many people would say Israel would wish to see that happen, and has intimated on numerous occasions, including reported by the Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak when he intimated that Benjamin Netanyahu approached him with the proposal to relocate the Gazan population, as well as a recently leaked intelligence document from the Israeli government that looked at the scenario of removing the Gazan population from Gaza and putting them in the Sinai on the Egyptian side. So this would be ethnic cleansing, and some people might define that as genocide from a particular location. So that, as in to remove an ethnicity from a location is the same as, in essence, wiping them out. So these are the kind of situations. But there's been international pressure on Israel, and of course, Israel sees that that's no longer possible. But it doesn't mean that they're making the conditions any better for the Gazans. But they have to buckle to international pressure, and they have been. They've been only recently forced to kind of allow aid in from the Israel side of the Gazan kind of border, you could say, if you want to call it a border. So only recently they've allowed aid in from there, when previously it was only from the Egyptian side. But also they've confined the Gazans to an area of Gaza called Mouassi, which is a very small enclosed area, the size of an airport. Many people have compared it to, and kind of confined them in. I'm concerned that once the Gazans are confined into this area, Israel might seek perhaps something short of a full ethnic cleansing from Gaza by, in essence, not allowing the Gazans to return to Gaza City or Khan Yunis and so on, but keeping them there penned into a new refugee camp, which will become a permanent refugee camp for the Gazans. So I'm concerned about this. I hope that's not the case, but I wouldn't put it past the Israeli administration to make that the new reality going forward.
No, because the Israelis aren't going to resettle Gaza if the Palestinians are there, but they could, as you say, create what they would call a buffer zone in the north of Gaza, in order to control that situation. But returning to Hamas, I mean, Hamas can't win militarily, but they don't need to. What they need to do is survive. If Israel doesn't destroy them, in a sense, that's a victory.
Well, I mean, I just want to say something before you said before, which is, yes, Israel can't settle an area when Gazans are there, if they're there. If they're not there, if they're not in Gaza City or Khan Yunis, then that can all be declared a security buffer zone. Israel done it many times in the West Bank itself, declare wide swaths of area as security zones and not permitted Palestinian settlement there. So they can pen in the Gazans for a long-term kind of arrangement, and I fear for that, because that means that they'll never be able to return back to their homes or what's left of their homes, and they'll never be able to rebuild. And then over time, that security zone, over a year or two or so, we'll start to see Israeli settlements being built in, which is the same method they've been using in the West Bank. But anyway, to go to your Gazan, your Hamas point, yes, the Hamas never intended to win, if by winning you mean the annihilation of the state of Israel. Of course, they don't have the resources to, they don't have the army to. That was never on the table. But it seems like their strategy was, in essence, to prevent the normalization of relations of Israel with Saudi Arabia and other states, to raise the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza with the rest of the world, and perhaps at the end of it, seek a settlement that might see Palestinians being granted a state. That's been their revised policy since their 2017 kind of new charter, where they proposed the point that they would be willing to have a long-term ceasefire with Israel and not a full recognition of Israel, but in essence, within the 1967 borders, a two-state solution. So in effect, a two-state solution. So they might be hoping that this would put the Gazan situation back on the agenda, because many people have, as Professor Norman Finkelstein put it, the world had forgotten the plight of the Gazans. And so rightly or wrongly, Hamas have undertaken, obviously, military operation in order to put that back on the agenda and for the world to solve the issue of the Gazans and grant them a state where they're no longer embargoed anymore, they're no longer blockaded anymore by Israel, and they can now control their own trade. That might be what Hamas has been intending all along.
Now, turning to the Americans' concern is obvious, that they don't want this situation to escalate. And we've seen the Houthis carrying out these attacks in the Red Sea, which have been effective in the sense that major shipping lines are now no longer using that route. We've seen Hezbollah engage in these artillery and drone exchanges on the north border. We've seen attacks by Israel into Syria. We've seen the Americans striking into Iraq, where they're facing opposition from Shia militia. That is the danger for the Americans, isn't it?
Well, yes, wider escalation. The issue is the pressure from the populations of the Muslim world against their governments is the concern of both the United States of America and their, some might call them client regimes, so regimes which are in the orbit of the United States. Their double standards, their cowardice, their lack of action, real action when it comes to what Israel is doing against Gaza. And the real action could be anything from implementing their own boycott against the state of Israel, stopping the supply of energy, which they currently do to the state of Israel, gas and oil. They could stop that. They could turn off those taps, for example. They could have a military show of force, even in the Mediterranean, just sending their warships out there, just to make a statement as just the very minimum of things that they could do. And of course, blockading trade into the state of Israel via the Red Sea, which the Houthis have actually engaged. And the fact that the Houthis don't fully control their own country, and yet they're able to implement some kind of an interdiction of supplies coming from the south to Israel, just shows that there's much more that the rest of the Muslim world can do when it comes to what Israel is doing against Gazans, and they could help save the Gazans. They could come and defend them. They could come and help them, and they could force Israel to kind of step back and withdraw what they're doing, and force them to the negotiating table, at least as a short-term measure, anyway. But we're not seeing that at all.
I mean, you're talking about the Arab states. I mean, one of the claims about Israel is it's the only democracy in the region. Now, let's not go there, because that's a topic in itself. But then contrasting that with autocratic Arab states, the point is surely that the United States in particular, but also the United Kingdom and others, they have moved a lot to create those autocratic states. And when we saw those autocratic states under challenge in the Arab Spring, they supported, for instance, the military coup in Egypt, which essentially restored military rule of the even more savage dictatorship under al-Sisi. And the al-Sisi regime in Egypt is essentially beholden to the United States. It's not going to challenge the United States.
Oh yes, the second largest recipient of U.S. finance and aid, military aid, is the Egyptian government in the region. And that tells you something, that Egypt is bought off by the United States. And of course, the United States supplies weapons to Saudi Arabia and UAE. In fact, it was the offer of next generation fighters to UAE that got UAE to agree to normalize its relations with Israel. So America has bought off many of the countries with promises of wiping off their debt, giving them military weapons, which require spare parts from the US, which means that these these states will never be able to fight wars that America doesn't approve of, because spare parts for the weapons you purchase, for your hardware, has to come from the manufacturer. And if manufacturers in the United States of America, you are then dependent on the United States of America.
Sorry, we have to move to a break. Thank you for joining us and for your insights. Take care. We're going to take a short break again. Join us after that break for our continued news coverage of the war in Palestine and the growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza.